The air in the barracks smelled of damp wool and fear. Outside, the Iowa wind howled a low, mournful tune across the frozen plains, rattling the thin window panes.
Clara pulled her threadbare blanket tighter around Lotta, the young girl shivering on the cot beside her.
Lotta's eyes were wide,
fixed on the American corporal standing by the door. He wasn't much older than Lotta. He held a stack of something impossibly white under one arm and a box of sharpened pencils in his hand. A posted rule, hand-painted in stark black letters near his head,
read, "Quiet hours, 21:6, no exceptions." But it was the silence now. In the middle of the afternoon, that was the loudest sound. The corporal cleared his throat,
the noise startling in the tense quiet. He set the items on the central table. "Right home," he said, his voice softer than the wind.
Clara felt Lotta flinch.
She placed a steadying hand on the girl's arm.
"It's all right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just paper." Stories like this remind us that humanity can be found in the most unexpected places.
Subscribe for more untold histories, and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. 6 weeks earlier, the Atlantic coast. The salt spray had long since faded from the air, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of the train. For 3 days, the American landscape had been a blur of greens and golds rushing past the grimy window, a world so vast and unbroken it felt like another planet. Clara kept her gaze fixed inward, counting the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track. It was a sound of finality.
Each click carried her further from the ruins of a life she barely recognized and deeper into a future she could not imagine. When the train finally hissed to a stop, the silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken fear. The command to disembark was rough, but not cruel. Stepping onto the gravel platform, Clara felt the late autumn sun on her face, a warmth that seemed alien and undeserved.
Before her stood Camp 17. It was not the grim fortress of barbed wire and searchlights from the propaganda films, but a collection of simple, dark wood barracks arranged in neat, unforgiving lines. The only thing that matched her expectations was the fence. It was tall and absolute. A young American soldier, his face a constellation of freckles, directed them into a processing line with short, clipped gestures.
Inside the first building, the air smelled intensely of disinfectant, a chemical cleanliness that tried to erase who they had been.
They surrendered what little they had, a worn photograph, a single button, a tarnished locket. Clara handed over nothing. She had learned long ago to carry her memories where no one could reach them. Her gaze fell upon the other women. Some were defiant, their jaws set like stone.
Others seemed to have collapsed inward, their eyes vacant.
An older woman near the front of the line, Frau Schmidt, stumbled, her legs giving way after the long journey. Clara tensed, expecting a shout, a shove. Instead, one of the young guards stepped forward, took the woman's arm to steady her, and then walked to a water cooler.
He returned with a paper cup of water, holding it out to her. No words were exchanged. The gesture was small, mechanical, perhaps just a rule he was ordered to follow.
But it was not unkind. Later, assigned to a bunk in the quiet chill of Barrack C, Clara lay on the thin mattress, her hands tucked beneath her head. Through the window, she could see the last light of day bleeding from the sky, silhouetting the guard tower at the edge of the camp. She thought of the guard and the cup of water.
It meant nothing, she told herself.
It was a crack too small to let any light in.
But it was a crack nonetheless. Days at Camp 17 were measured not in hours, but in bells. A sharp, clanging bell for waking, another for roll call, another for meals.
The routine was the true warden, a structure as rigid and inescapable as the fence.
Clara learned the rules quickly. Stand straight during the count, finish everything on your plate, never speak unless spoken to.
The language barrier was a wall within a wall. The guards' English was a torrent of sounds she could not pass, their commands understood only through gestures and the sharp tone of their voices. Life was reduced to a series of physical motions. In the mess hall, each woman had her designated spot, her tray, and a grey tin cup.
The cup became Clara's constant companion, its cold metallic surface a familiar weight in her hands.
It was the vessel for watery coffee in the morning and thin soup at night. She would trace the rim with her thumb during the long, silent meals, the taste of the food invariably bland. Oatmeal, boiled potatoes, bread that was soft but flavourless. It was sustenance, nothing more.
It was, as the camp commander had explained through a translator on their first day, what was required by international law. Clara felt her identity eroding with each passing day. She was no longer a nurse, a daughter, a German. She was prisoner number 734, a number shouted across the frozen yard during the morning count. The sense of uselessness was a physical ache, a hollowness that no amount of food could fill. She watched the other women, saw the same emptiness reflected in their eyes.
They were ghosts haunting the shells of their former selves. One evening, a young woman named Lotta, who slept in the bunk below hers, began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the cold barracks. By morning her face was flushed with fever, and she was shivering uncontrollably under her thin blanket. The other women kept their distance, a mixture of fear and apathy on their faces.
But for Clara, something stirred. It was the muscle memory of her profession, a purpose that had been dormant for months. She went to Lotta's side, her hands moving with an old, forgotten confidence. She felt the girl's forehead, checked her pulse, and saw the familiar signs of pneumonia. She dipped a rag in a basin of cold water and placed it on Lotta's brow.
She spoke to her in low, soothing German, telling her to breathe slowly.
When a guard passed on his rounds, Clara stood and,
using the few English words she knew,
said firmly, "Sick, need doctor." The guard,
surprised by her directness, hesitated for a moment before nodding and leaving to fetch the camp medic. In that small act of defiance, Clara felt a flicker of the person she used to be.
She had a role again, however small.
But it was a painful reminder of a world she had lost, and the silence that followed the guard's departure felt deeper than before. A week after Lotta's fever broke, a new routine began. A flatbed truck would arrive at dawn, its engine rumbling through the morning mist, to take a dozen women out to work on the local farm. The American government had a severe labor shortage, and the prisoners were the solution. Clara found herself on that truck one morning, huddled against the cold, watching the camp fence recede into the distance. For the first time in months, she was outside the wire, but the freedom was an illusion. A young corporal with a rifle sat at the back of the truck, his eyes scanning the endless fields of harvested corn. The farm was a picture of tranquility that felt jarringly out of place. A simple white house, a large red barn, and chickens scratching in the dirt. The farmer, a man whose face was a road map of wrinkles from years under the sun, met them at the gate. He didn't speak to them, only to the guard, pointing towards a field of potatoes that needed digging. His wife watched from the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable but distant. Clara felt their eyes on her, on all of them, a heavy weight of judgment. They were not women.
They were the enemy, tilling the soil of a land they had been at war with. The work was brutal. The frozen earth fought against their shovels, and soon Clara's hands, accustomed to the delicate work of a nurse, were raw and blistered.
The sun climbed higher, but the wind remained sharp, cutting through their thin coats. They worked in silence, a grim line of grey figures against the brown earth, the farmer watching from a distance, never too far away.
He was not cruel, merely vigilant. At midday, the guard called for a break.
They sat on the cold ground, eating the bread and cheese they had been given, their backs aching. Clara watched the farmer's wife emerge from the house.
The woman walked hesitantly towards them, carrying a small plate.
She avoided their eyes, her movements stiff and deliberate.
She set the plate on an overturned wooden crate a few feet away from them, and then turned and walked quickly back to the house without a word.
On the plate were 3 slices of apple pie. For a long moment no one moved. It was an offering, a gesture so unexpected it felt like a trap. Finally, Frau Schmidt, the oldest among them, slowly got up and took a piece. Then another woman did. Clara took the last slice. The pastry was flaky, the apples sweet with cinnamon. It was a taste of a life she had almost forgotten, a simple, human kindness. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was a piece of pie on a cold Tuesday in Iowa. But as the truck rattled back to camp that evening, the memory of that small, silent offering stayed with Clara, a tiny point of warmth in the vast, cold landscape of her new reality. The small warmth from the farmer's gesture faded as the weeks turned colder. November arrived, bringing with it a biting wind that swept across the flat Iowa plains and seemed to carry whispers of home. News was a forbidden currency, more precious than food or warmth. The women scavenged for scraps of it, trading rumors in hushed German in the dark of the barracks. Berlin was in ruins. The Russians were in control of the east. People were starving. Each rumor was a fresh torment, painting a horrifying picture of the world they had left behind. Clara tried to shield herself from it, but the not knowing was a constant, gnawing ache in her gut. The American guards were tight-lipped, their faces betraying nothing. The only connection to the outside world was a radio that sometimes played from the guards' quarters, its faint sounds drifting across the yard. It played jaunty swing music and advertisements for products Clara could not comprehend. Coca-Cola, Chevrolet cars. The cheerful, carefree sounds felt like a form of psychological torture, a reminder of a world that was moving on without them, a world where people laughed and danced while their own homes were possibly gone forever. One afternoon, while cleaning the administrative building, Clara saw Corporal Miller sitting at a desk, struggling with a small dictionary. He was younger than most of the other guards, with kind eyes that didn't hold the same hard edge. He seemed to sense her presence and looked up, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Trying to learn some German," he said, tapping the book. "Not so easy," Clara merely nodded, not wanting to engage. But then Miller, perhaps trying to fill the awkward silence, continued. "My ma, she worries. Writes me every week. I told her I'm fine, but you know mothers." He sighed, then looked at Clara as if a thought had just struck him. "It's tough not hearing from family. The Red Cross is trying to get letters through to over there." He gestured vaguely eastward. "It's slow. Everything is a mess." He said it casually, a simple statement of fact. But for Clara, the words landed with the force of a physical blow. Letters. The possibility was a spark in the suffocating darkness, so bright it was painful. She had not dared to even form the hope. She finished her work in a daze, her hands trembling slightly. Back in the barracks, she didn't share what she had heard. It was too fragile a hope to be spoken aloud, to be risked against the crushing weight of the other women's despair. That night, for the first time in a long time, Clara allowed herself to picture her mother's face. The image brought both comfort and a profound, terrifying wave of fear for what a letter might one day say. The hope Corporal Miller had planted was a dangerous seed. It grew roots in the dark, a fragile thing Clara was terrified to acknowledge. For 2 weeks, she pushed the thought of letters away, focusing on the monotonous rhythm of camp life, the wake-up bell, the work details, the metallic taste of water from her tin cup. Hope was a vulnerability, and she had learned to be hard. Then, one afternoon in early December, the routine was broken. After the evening meal, as the women were preparing to return to the barracks, a lieutenant and Corporal Miller entered the mess hall. They were carrying wooden crates. The lieutenant spoke, and another soldier translated into stilted German. "You will be permitted to write letters home." A stunned silence fell over the room. It was one thing to harbor a secret hope, another to have it spoken into existence by their captors. Miller and the other soldier began walking down the rows of tables, placing a single sheet of clean white paper and a sharpened pencil in front of each woman. Clara stared at the paper. It was a simple object, yet it felt impossibly foreign and powerful. For months, her world had been grey and brown, the colour of uniforms, dirt, and watery soup. This stark whiteness was a shock to the senses. It was a blank space in a life that was otherwise completely dictated. It held the potential for connection, for a voice, but it also held the weight of everything she could not say.
How could she describe her life here without causing worry?
How could she ask about home without revealing her own terror? The translator's voice cut through the silence again. Letters will be censored. They must be in simple English for the Red Cross. We will help you translate. Source: International Red Cross. POW Mail Regulations. Around her, the first hesitant sounds began. The scrape of a chair, a muffled sob, the soft scratching of pencil on paper. Many women wept openly, their tears staining the pristine white sheets. Clara picked up the pencil. Its hexagonal wooden body felt unfamiliar in her calloused fingers. She thought of her mother, of the small kitchen in Berlin, of the smell of baking bread. What could she say that would cross the ocean and bypass the censors? What message could possibly survive such a journey? She decided on simplicity, honesty, but of a kind that could not be misconstrued as complaint or propaganda. She wrote her name, her prisoner number, and then slowly, with Miller patiently helping her find the right English words, she wrote, "Dearest mother, I am alive. I am well. The work is hard, but I am healthy.
I think of you every day.
Please tell me you are safe.
Tell me of home."
Your daughter, Clara. She folded the paper as she was shown and handed it to the lieutenant. It was gone from her hands, a small white rectangle swallowed by a large canvas bag. The act left her feeling utterly hollowed out. She had sent a piece of her soul out into the unknown, with no promise it would ever arrive, and even less of a promise that a reply would ever come back. After the letters were sent, a different kind of silence settled over the camp. It was not the quiet of resignation, but a tense, fragile stillness, stretched thin with waiting. Every footstep on the gravel path, every unfamiliar voice from the guards' quarters made the women look up, their faces etched with a desperate hope. Days bled into weeks, and the hope began to curdle into suspicion and anxiety. The shared vulnerability of writing home had briefly united them, but the prolonged silence now drove them apart, each woman retreating into her own private world of fear. The atmosphere outside the barracks grew colder, too, and not just from the encroaching winter. The guards' interactions became clipped and formal. Corporal Miller's easy smiles were gone, replaced by a guarded professionalism. One day, Frau Schmidt, who understood more English than she let on, overheard a guard complaining about an article in the Des Moines Register. "Says we're coddling them," the guard had grumbled, "giving them pie and letting them write love letters home while our boys are dying." The news spread through the barracks like a virus, confirming their deepest fears. They were hated here. The small kindnesses they had received were not signs of compassion, but sources of public resentment. Seeking refuge from the oppressive tension, Clara volunteered for the most solitary jobs. One afternoon, she was tasked with cleaning a small, forgotten storage room in the back of the administrative building. The room was filled with dust and disused furniture, smelling of mildew and old paper. In a corner, beneath a moth-eaten blanket, she found a wooden crate filled with books. They were all in English, their covers worn and soft to the touch. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Pride and Prejudice, a collection of poems by a man named Robert Frost. She picked up a thin volume, its title faded. Tucked inside as a bookmark was a stiff piece of cardstock. It was a library card from the Algona Public Library. A woman's name was typed neatly at the top. Eleanor Vance. Below it,
a series of dates had been stamped in faint purple ink, a record of books borrowed and returned.
A quiet testament to a life lived in a peaceful world of stories. Clara ran her thumb over the last stamped date, August 1943, before her capture, before everything. Holding the small card, she felt a sudden, sharp pang of connection, Not to the enemy, but to a person, a woman who read books.
A woman who lived in this town.
It was an anchor to a normality she thought was lost forever. This, she decided, was something she could do for herself. This was something they couldn't control. Slipping a small, simple children's primer from the bottom of the crate, she hid it within the folds of her uniform. That night, long after the other women were asleep, Clara sat in the shadows of her bunk, the tiny book open in her lap. By the faint moonlight slanting through the window, she began to teach herself the enemy's language, one silent word at a time. Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh blanket of snow that muffled the camp in an unnatural quiet. The barbed wire fences looked like they were laced with sugar, a cruel mockery of holiday decoration. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with unspoken memories of past Christmases, of families gathered, of candlelight on pine trees, of warmth and safety. Frau Schmidt had managed to procure a small branch from a pine tree during a work detail, and it sat in a tin cup in the center of the room, its scent a sharp, clean reminder of everything they had lost as darkness fell. A profound melancholy settled over the women. To combat it, one of the older women, Greta, began to hum. It was a tune every German knew, a melody that was woven into the fabric of childhood. Soon, another voice joined her, then another. Hesitantly, they began to sing Stille Nacht. Their voices were soft, tired, and thin, but they rose together in the cold air, a fragile prayer for peace. Clara hung the library card from the pine branch, a small, flat ornament representing a world of quiet order she desperately missed. From the guards' quarters, the radio crackled to life, playing American Christmas music. The smooth, crooning voice of a man singing about a white Christmas drifted across the snow-covered yard. The two melodies clashed, one a solemn, centuries-old hymn of hope in darkness, the other a modern ballad of nostalgic longing. For a moment, Clara felt a surge of resentment. Their quiet moment was being invaded, drowned out by the victor's comfortable sentimentality. She glanced towards the window and froze.
A figure was standing just outside in the snow, his silhouette framed by the faint light from the guard tower.
It was Corporal Miller. He wasn't moving to stop them. He was simply standing there, his head slightly bowed, listening. As their voices swelled for the final verse, Clara could just make out his shoulders rising and falling in a slow, deep breath. He seemed not like a guard, but like a man who was also far from home on Christmas Eve. He understood the ache of the song, if not the words. The realization struck Clara with surprising force. Loneliness was a language that needed no translation. The song ended. The women sat in silence, the last notes seeming to hang in the air. Outside, the radio continued to play, but it no longer felt like an intrusion. It was just another sound in a world full of lonely people. For those few minutes, there had been no victor and no vanquished, only the shared, silent space of a holy night. The peace was shattered the next morning. A guard entered the mess hall during breakfast and made an announcement, translated with blunt efficiency. A letter has arrived through the Red Cross, one letter, for 80 women. Hope and dread descended on the room in a single, suffocating wave. The air in the mess hall grew thin, each woman holding her breath. 80 names, 80 silent prayers hung suspended in the space between the guard and the small, rectangular envelope in his hand. Time seemed to warp, stretching the seconds into an unbearable length. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She felt a dizzying mix of yearning and terror. She wanted the letter to be for her more than anything in the world, and she was terrified of what it might say. The guard cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the document he held. He spoke a single name, the sound of it dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Greta. A collective sigh, a wave of released tension and sharp disappointment washed over the room. It was not for Clara. For a fleeting, shameful moment, envy coiled in her stomach. Then she saw the look on Greta's face. The older woman, who had started the singing on Christmas Eve, stared at the guard, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her hands trembled as she slowly rose and walked to the front of the room. She took the letter with the reverence of a priestess handling a sacred relic. The paper was thin, worn, and covered in official-looking stamps from both the German authorities and the Red Cross. It had survived an impossible journey. Greta returned to her seat, the other women unconsciously leaning in, their own hopes now vested in her. With fumbling fingers, she tore it open. The silence returned, broken only by the rustle of the paper. Greta's eyes scanned the page, her lips moving silently. Then a single tear traced a path through the wrinkles on her cheek, followed by another. It was impossible to know if they were tears of joy or sorrow. Finally, she looked up, her gaze sweeping over the anxious faces watching her. "It is from my daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She took a shaky breath and began to read aloud, translating the simple German into halting phrases. "Dearest mother, we are safe. Father's cough is better. The winter is cold, but we have enough wood. The cat had her kittens in the barn." She paused, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Kittens. Such a small, mundane detail from a world away. It was a detail so profoundly normal it felt like a miracle. It was proof that life, in its simple, stubborn way, continued. It was proof that a connection, however fragile, still existed. A wave of relief so powerful it was almost painful swept through Clara. It wasn't just a letter. It was a sign. It was confirmation that their words had not vanished into a void, that the system, impossibly, worked. The envy she had felt moments before dissolved, replaced by a shared, quiet joy for Greta. The news of kittens in a barn in Germany was a victory for them all. Hope was no longer a dangerous, abstract thing. It was real, and it fit on a single, flimsy piece of paper. Clara settled back, a new resolve hardening within her. She could wait. Now she knew she was waiting for something that could actually arrive. Greta's letter changed the emotional weather of the camp. Hope, once a dangerous contraband, was now a shared currency. More letters began to trickle in over the following weeks, each one a public event, each piece of mundane news, a successful harvest, a mended roof, celebrated as a collective triumph. The women began to see themselves not just as prisoners, but as a community of waiting. Clara continued her secret English lessons, the children's primer becoming her constant companion. The words were simple, but they were a key, unlocking a world that had been closed to her. She found herself observing Corporal Miller more closely. She noticed how young he was, how the uniform seemed a size too big for his shoulders, how he often stood gazing out at the vast, flat Iowa landscape with the same lost expression she saw on the faces of her fellow prisoners. He was a farm boy, she guessed, more comfortable with tractors than with rifles. He performed his duties with a quiet efficiency, but his heart was clearly not in it. He was a guardian, not a warrior. One evening, while on late cleaning duty in the administrative building, she saw him. He was alone, standing under the weak glow of a bare bulb in the hallway, his back to her. He thought no one was watching. He had taken something from his breast pocket. It was a photograph, its corners soft and creased from countless viewings. He stared down at it, his shoulders slumping, and for a moment the soldier vanished, leaving only a boy consumed by a profound and familiar ache. Homesickness. Clara's heart gave a painful lurch. She knew that look. She lived with that ache every second of every day. The rules were clear. No fraternization. To speak to him was a risk. She could be punished, her small privileges revoked. But in that silent hallway, the rules of the war seemed absurd and distant. All she saw was another human being trapped and lonely. Before she could second-guess herself, she took a step forward. The scuff of her shoe on the linoleum made him start. He quickly shoved the photograph back into his pocket, his face hardening into the neutral mask of a guard. "Something you need?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Clara's English words, so clear in the privacy of her mind, deserted her.
Her throat was dry.
She held up her cleaning rag, a pathetic excuse for her presence. Then, gathering all her courage, she looked at him and said haltingly, "You..."
"Home?"
He stared at her, suspicion warring with surprise in his eyes. He didn't answer. Clara tried again, pointing to her own heart. "Family," she said, the word feeling strange and precious on her tongue. "You..." "Miss Family." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of shared experience. Something in his expression softened. The rigid set of his shoulders relaxed. After a long moment, he slowly pulled the photograph from his pocket again and held it out for her to see. It was a black-and-white picture of a smiling man and woman standing in front of a simple farmhouse, their faces weathered by sun and work. "My parents," he said softly. "Our farm. It's not far from here." Clara looked from the faces in the photograph to the young man in front of her. The enemy had a name. Now he had a family. He had a home just over the horizon. The knowledge settled not as a comfort, but as a heavy, complicated truth. A small bridge of understanding had just been built in the dim hallway, and Clara was terrified of where it might lead. Spring melted into a sweltering Iowa summer. News of the war's end in Europe arrived not with a bang, but as a series of disjointed radio reports translated and posted on the camp bulletin board. Berlin had fallen. The Reich was no more. The news was met not with celebration, but with a profound, aching silence. Victory for the Americans meant an unknown, terrifying future for the prisoners. They were no longer soldiers of a nation at war. They were simply Germans, citizens of a ruined country, their families lost somewhere in the chaos. The waiting became heavier, the silence in the barracks deeper. It was on one such stifling afternoon that the guard entered the mess hall. But this time he walked directly to Clara. In his hand was a single, precious envelope. "Clara," he said, and the world seemed to stop. Every eye in the room was on her as she walked forward, her legs feeling like they were moving through water. Her hands were numb as she took the letter. It felt impossibly light, too fragile to contain the weight of her entire world. She recognized the spidery handwriting of her mother instantly. She returned to her bunk, the other women respectfully giving her space. She sat on the edge of the cot, the letter trembling in her hands. This was it. The moment that had sustained her and terrified her for months. The answer. She could feel Corporal Miller's words from that afternoon in the field, months ago, echoing in her mind. Just a simple line, "So they know you're safe." He had been talking about her safety, but now the words were reversed. All she wanted was a simple line. "Mama, Papa, are you safe?" With a shaky breath, she opened the envelope. The single sheet of paper inside was filled with her mother's familiar script. Her eyes scanned the page, her heart pounding a deafening rhythm in her ears. "My dearest Clara," it began, "we are alive.
Your father and I are alive.
The house is gone, but we are staying with neighbors. The city is in ruins, but the linden tree in the old square is somehow still standing. We received your letter, knowing you are safe. It was like breathing again after being underwater for years." Clara read the lines again and again, the words blurring through her tears. Alive. The house is gone, but we are alive. The simplicity of it was overwhelming. It was not a happy ending, but it was an ending she could build a future on. The letter did not erase the horrors of the war, the losses, or the uncertainty that lay ahead. But it was a foundation. It was a single, stubborn linden tree standing amidst the rubble. That evening, as she stood by the fence, watching the sun set over the cornfields, Corporal Miller approached her. He didn't speak for a long time, just stood beside her, looking out at the horizon. "Good news?" he finally asked, his voice gentle. Clara nodded, clutching the precious letter in her pocket. "Yes," she whispered, finding the English word with ease. "Good news." "They are alive!" A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of genuine relief. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm real glad to hear that." In that moment, standing by a barbed wire fence in the middle of America, there was no guard and no prisoner. There were only two people, separated by a fallen empire and a world of pain, who understood the simple, profound relief of a letter from home. The war had not been stopped by this single piece of paper, but for Clara its brutal noise had finally begun to fade, replaced by the quiet, resilient sound of a linden tree's leaves rustling in the wind.